Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to do a slightly different style of video where I'm going to keep everything roughly real time and talk you through it. I got this paper, this Strathmore watercolor wind power paper. I just picked it up because I had ran out of a easy to grab watercolor block and I wanted some new paper before I move. And I've never used this paper before. Usually I use Arches or Fabriano paper that comes in sheets and I stretch it myself, or I just use a sketchbook. I've used the fluid watercolor paper before and I quite like the cold press from them, but it's not as easily available as, say, Strathmore. So I wanted to see if this was to my liking, if it was any good. It's a little bit pricier than a Canson XL, but I much prefer the texture of the paper on here. I bought this one for the texture. So it's 140 pound, and we're gonna see how it behaves. I have some nice yellow bell peppers here to paint. I actually don't really like bell peppers. I love hot peppers. I think banana peppers are probably one of my favorite things to have on a sandwich or a wrap or anything. I love banana peppers, but I really don't like eating bell peppers, except they're so beautiful that I'm gonna paint them instead. So I've got a couple bell peppers here. I will sketch them up and then I'll talk you through my painting process with these. I'm gonna do them in watercolor. I'm gonna be using this travel palette here. This is sort of a mix of different colors, but the star of the show is gonna be this M-Gram Azo Yellow and this M-Gram New Gamboge. So definitely for these yellow peppers, these are going to be really useful colors. And I have a ton of them in this palette, so I'm going to use this one. And then my greens will come over here from this Stone Ground Paint Co. Florentine green, or I can mix in a bit of this Redwood Willow Prussian blue to the yellow and make my greens that way. So I'm going to be using a big juicy Richardson 12 round. This is awesome. And we'll just start drawing away, I guess. Let's see, maybe I'll get this out of the way. We'll see how big the drawing is and then maybe I'll zoom in. But I'm mostly going for the, I don't know, the simplicity of color for this. So I'm not going to focus too much on getting the exact proportions of the pepper right. So it's just going to be really quick. Like, this is just basically, for me, this is a warm-up. I'm going to be filming another video right after this, so I'm not going to spend too long. And even though I want this to be a real-time video, I don't want it to be like a long video, you know. So we're just going to get really loose with the washes. I mean, like, not messy loose, but sort of let the paint do its own thing and not worry too much about the details in the end. Fruits and vegetables are nice for that because often what you get is just like a big area of bright luminous color. You get a lot of subsurface scattering in there, and then basically you're just doing one big pepper shaped wash and then the detail comes in at the stem, and that's usually about it. So I find fruits and vegetables are like, you can make a nice looking little painting really quickly, and they're just to learn, you know, they're just to learn how to mix colors, and you really get some of the purest, brightest colors in plants, especially yellow. Like, you don't find a yellow this pure in animals, really. Like, maybe in some fish, but birds especially, their yellow pigments tend to lean a little more green. Like, you wouldn't think that looking at a warbler, but they do end up quite green and desaturated for the most part. Like, they'll get high areas of saturation, but it's not the whole animal, whereas the pepper, It's kind of the whole thing. In art school, we used to call these kitchen paintings, you know, because they would make us do still lifes for our media exploration class where we got taught watercolor, and they would always turn out looking like exactly the sort of thing that would be in a restaurant or like in your grandma's kitchen. So yeah, I always think of art school when I'm doing these, which is nice. I liked art school. I liked it quite a lot. I don't know if you're going to be able to hear it, but there's some squeaky birds outside my window. It's finally spring in Canada. Feels like it hasn't been spring for a very long time. And then I'm just going to really loosely sketch in the shadow over here. I actually get quite a hard shadow with the lighting I have on this vegetable, but I'm going to soften it out basically. Like, I don't want it to be that hard. I've also set it so that it's going to fit in my sketchbook later, because that's where I'm going to store this painting. So the shadow kind of just makes it too big is what I'm saying. So I'm going to zoom in here now, and we'll get this focused and all that good stuff and get to the paint. Alright, so I think that's a pretty good distance. I've got the macro mode enabled, and I'm going to start with a wash of just pure azo yellow. I really want to get some of those brights along the top of the pepper, and I'm going to leave my highlights white. There's definitely specular highlights on here, so the first wash I find it's easier to not focus too much on the colors and just look at the shapes and make sure you're preserving the whites in the right places, because with watercolor, once you go over those whites, they're never going to be completely white anymore. Even if you do a lot of lifting techniques, which I don't tend to like. I just don't do them a lot personally. Some people can make it look really good. I don't think I'm very good at it. Even with lifting techniques, you're still going to get some of that staining. Even if it's a non-staining color, it's going to change the texture of the paper, and you don't have that purity anymore. So I'm just making sure that on this very first pass I keep all the highlights intact. And even down here there's some reflected highlights on the bottom of the pepper, so I'm going to make sure to keep those clear as well. Those are reflecting off of my desk, which is not a white desk, it's a gray desk, but it's got a fairly, it's like a satin finish to it, so it does reflect quite a bit, but it ends up not as bright as the brighter white highlights, just because it's gray, which is useful. Sometimes if I'm setting up a still life and I want more reflected highlights and more reflected light, I'll put it on a piece of white paper, because white's gonna be the purest reflector. If you wanted reflected light in different colors, you can put your still life object on a colored piece of paper or something like that. There's a lot of things you can do to bounce the light around. And here, while it's still wet, I am going in with some of that M-Gram New Gamboge and warming up this yellow, because the yellow on the pepper is actually, it's quite warm everywhere except for right around the specular highlights. So just trying to nudge that warmth in here, and then I will start getting into the shadows. Because my light source over there is actually quite dramatic, I'm going to get more shadows on this pepper than maybe you normally would. Depending on the intensity of the light, that's going to dictate the intensity of your shadows. And I'm working quickly here because I want everything to sort of blend into each other and stay wet, because the pepper and the highlights are, like, the shadows are all very soft. Even the shadow coming off of the stem is very soft, so this is gonna be a really quick painting. But that's fun, like, it's nice to do something that doesn't take up your whole day. So doing still lifes, I find, helps you observe light and what light does and how it behaves, and then you're able to make more informed decisions about your final illustrations. Like, you can alter your value patterns of your illustrations by altering the lighting situation, if that makes sense. Like, if you want something to stand out from the background, but you do want the lighting to be affecting the background as well, what you can do is basically induce some reflected light. And then you can make like rim lighting around your character, or like, you know, light the character in a slightly different color or something like that. And I say character, it doesn't always have to be a character. It can be like, it can be a pepper, haha. I went to school for illustration, so a lot of what we did was character illustration, but I don't find myself drawing humans like all that much in my practice currently. I'm more of an animal artist. I like doing landscapes and trees and stuff like that, and that's mostly what I do for my professional practice as well. So a character is not necessarily a person. Figure is not necessarily a person either. Figure is just whatever you're supposed to be focusing on in an illustration. And anything that's not the figure is the ground. And that's a little bit of some illustration jargon for you. So, because I'm heading into some slightly more it's not like they're hard lines, but because I want to vary the color quite a bit for these harder shadows, even though they're still quite soft, I'm gonna let this dry. I'm gonna let the yellow dry anyway, but I'm going to mix up a green for the stem, I think. That'll do. That's gonna blend in a little bit too, but I don't really mind that. We're gonna go in on, this is probably only gonna be like a 2-layer painting. Doesn't need to be very complicated, it's just a pepper. But yeah, we'll leave that. So far I'm liking this paper quite a bit. It's a really nice, just sort of like go-to paper, and I quite like the texture. I find that it's causing some colors to granulate more than they would on the paper that I'm used to, but usually I work on something that's a little smoother. Not like fully hot press, but just a little bit smoother. How wet are these edges? Yeah, I'm going to leave those alone before I do the shadow. So I'm just gonna let this dry and then I will be right back. Alright, so I think it's dried enough that I can work on the shadow, which is a very complex color. So I'm actually going to mix over here in my tin palette a very dark color of multiple pigments, and then my hope is that it will granulate nicely and we'll get a really pretty shadow color. So because the table is sort of a cool gray, the base of the shadow is sort of also a cool gray. And because the light is natural lighting from outside, you're getting the shadow that comes with the blue sky. Not a lot of the blue sky is visible from here, but shadows tend to be cool when they've got a lot of natural light on them. But then you're also getting the bounce light from the bottom of the pepper, which is yellow or orange, but it's very dim, so it's basically like you're getting a shadow that gradiates from a very warm dark color in here to a cool dark color out here, which is a very subtle distinction, and it's not super obvious, but I can see that and I can rationalize it in my head, so I'm going to do my best to mix that, and it'll take a few tries. Like basically the more pigment you have, the darker it'll get. So basically I'm mixing Prussian blue, alizarin crimson, and new gamboge, which I don't know, that might not be like a obvious choice to go with, but I think it's gonna work. So yeah, the shadow is super dark, so I'm really just packing the pigment in there. And I'm gonna make sure with the shadow to basically do it all in one wash. I find with shadows that's the best way to do it. The longer you fuss with a shadow, the more chance you have of wrecking it basically. So you really want to get a shadow laid down in one go, and then basically at that point it is what it is, and you can't really go back and change it. Sometimes you can do 2 layers of a shadow as long as you stay in the exact same spot, but shadows are very consistent. Usually it's just like a single controlled gradient, and just from personal experience and from the experience of other people at art school, like the longer you fuss with the shadow, the worse it looks. So that's why I always like sort of sketch out the edge of the shadow and just lay it down and hope it looks good. So I can see that the pigments in here are separating kind of nicely, and I think that's gonna do it. It's still a bit wet, so I'm going to try to plop some more warms right underneath the pepper. Just kind of dab those in there. Just like that, because it's still wet and I can still play with it. Oops, but I just got a couple flecks on the pepper itself. So I'm gonna leave that for now. I think that's about all I can do for the shadow. It is quite a dark shadow, and it's cool, like the contrast between these. It's gonna look a little more realistic once I get the second layer of shadows on the pepper itself. But while the shadow dries, I'm going to work on the stem, and it's not going to be too much work to get the details in there. I'm just going to be very careful that I don't touch that big shadowy puddle while it's drying. And I'm not being too precise with these darks for the stem. I'm basically just squiggling them in, and I'm gonna blend the edges out after. Got a little bit more in here. Bit more here, and then of course you're getting bounce light, or reflected light. I just always call it bounce light. But you're getting reflected color onto the stem from the pepper itself. So just gonna dab a bit of gamboge into the stem. And now that that is all set in, I'm just going to very lightly kind of blend out the edges. The stem actually has some really nice like veining on it. And if I was using a smaller brush, I would definitely focus a little more on that, but I'm using a number 12. It's pretty big for the size of the painting I'm doing. So I'm not going to worry too much about getting all the detail on there. I think suggesting it is good enough. Okay, I'm gonna mix some of that gamboge with a bit of a French ochre and thin that out. That's going to be the start of our shadows. That's a little warm, actually. Okay, no, if I thin it out, it's good. Hopefully all the noises from outside aren't too distracting. It's really nice to have some actual springtime now. I live in Canada, so it's been winter for, it feels like a million years by this point. Today, by the way, is May 6th. Yeah, May 6th. This video will be going up a little bit later, but today it's May 6th. There are robins singing outside. Those are American robins, of course. And overall, it's just a really nice day. I went for a really short walk to the free little library down the street to drop off some books that I've decided to get rid of, so I'm not bringing them with me on my move. And yeah, that was really nice. Just putting a bit of green in this shadow here because it's reflecting from the stem. Yeah, that'll do. Down here, since I have these sort of areas of reflected light, I'm just being careful to blend those with the shadows with a little bit of water just to keep everything consistent and good looking. And I'm being very, very careful not to let my light colored paint touch these dark shadows, because if I do, it'll bloom into the pepper, and it'll be very hard to sort of combat that. It'll desaturate my oranges right away. I mean, because these are shadows, they're a little bit desaturated anyway. But yeah, the last thing I want to do with these really nice colors is touch this really dark color and have everything get muddy. sometimes you want muddy, like sometimes you want a desaturated painting, but because I'm doing a still life, I'm trying to stay true to the vegetable before me and try to make a good painting of it. So, but I do need to get a little bit darker down here, so I'm just going to be very careful. I think it's fairly dry around this edge, but I just don't want to tempt it really. So I'm going to be very careful down there. Drop a little bit more of this French ochre in there, just like that. Yeah, and I think that'll do. Almost done, I think. I'm pretty pleased with this pepper. Just going to... Haha, do you hear that squeaky noise? That is a northern flicker, a type of woodpecker. And they're very cute. They like to come to this yard. When I move, I'm gonna have to figure out what new animals live in my new neighborhood. It's a slightly different climate where I'm moving to, so I'll have to get used to probably a different proportion of local birds, but it's not too different. It's only about an hour and a half away. I do know that we're gonna see fewer osprey, which is too bad, but probably more great horned owls. So, I mean, that's probably a pretty fair trade. We can always come back and visit the osprey on weekends anyway. Alright. Well, I don't really want to mess with this too much anymore. I'm just going to soften a few of these edges. So that way the specular highlights are the crispiest edges, and that around the shadow. And I think I'm happy with this. This paper is totally fine. Yeah, I have no real complaints about it. It's, of course it buckles with the moisture like every paper does, but I really don't mind that. And I do like the texture that I'm getting out of it, and the colors are drying super nice on it. So that's a thumbs up for this Strathmore Wind Power watercolor paper, and a thumbs up for painting a yellow pepper, even though I'm still not gonna eat it. If you liked this video, please give me a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, let me know your feelings in the comments below. Let me know if you have any video suggestions or questions about watercolor, gouache, freelance illustration, or birds, I guess. I can answer questions about whatever you want to ask. I'll try my best. I hope you liked this one, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!